All right, great, good. All right, good evening, everybody who's here, everybody who's not here. Please enjoy the last time you'll see me doing this without a mask, because we'll be starting up the masks as of Friday, I guess, is the mandatory mask policy. So this is the last one I'll be doing here without a mask being on. Starting next week, I will have the mask on, I promise, and I will have the microphone much closer to my face to try and get rid of all the mandatory muffling that I'll be doing. Last time we talked about the introduction, which I will admit was at least slightly dry, but tonight we're talking about divine omnipotence. The logic of it is going to get like slightly complicated, but it's actually not that tough to work out what he's talking about, because the whole purpose about talking about divine omnipotence is going to be, and it boils down to this, which is if God is all powerful, can he do absolutely anything? And that's the question on its face seems simple, because if God's all powerful, then for sure he can do everything. That's what all powerful means. But of course, it exists in the framework of saying, what does everything mean? Can God do the impossible? And the answer is yes, within reason. But we'll get into that very quickly. If you go to the beginning of the chapter, Thomas Aquinas' quote says, "Nothing which implies contradiction falls under the omnipotence of God." That is a very important thing to internalize moving forward. That there are certain things that will be impossible, not through not having any kind of divine influence over it, but certain things that are impossible just based on a logical impossibility. That certain things can't be done based on logic alone, and in that case, they can't be done by God because they're logically impossible, if you see what I mean. But we'll get to that in a second. So it begins by saying, if God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures are not happy. Therefore, God lacks either goodness or power or both. This is the problem of pain in its simplest form. The possibility of answering it depends on showing that the terms good and almighty, and perhaps also the term happy, are equivocal. For it must be admitted from the outset that if the popular meanings attached to these words are the best, or the only possible meanings, then the argument is unanswerable. In this chapter, I shall make some comments on the idea of omnipotence, and in the following, some on the idea of goodness. So yeah, if somebody presents to you that simple logical conundrum and says to you, if God's all-powerful and he wants everybody to be happy and people aren't happy, I guess God either isn't all-powerful or isn't good. And sure enough, if presented as a logical puzzle, it does fail on that one, unless you start to dig down into what possible and good are, because those are terms that have to be defined, and defined carefully, because you can't work with terms like happy. I've never liked this. Maybe you guys have. I don't know. I can't speak for you on that one. But every time something gets people get surveyed and there's like a happiness index where they say, so how happy are you? I'm like, cripes. Like that's not like a measurement like how much gas is in your gas tank, that kind of thing, where it's quantifiable. If somebody says, how happy are you? Like, I don't know, kind of. Like I do okay. I'm in a good mood today, I suppose. But it's not a quantifiable factor where like every time somebody puts a poll up and says, like people report an increase in 14% of happiness. I'm like, jeepers, we can do that? Like there's a meter on us, like we're in The Sims, where you can just gauge somebody's happiness and satisfaction like that? It seems unlikely. And if we're saying if God loves people and wants them to be happy, why aren't they happy? I'm like, well, you got to define happy as well. Anyway, moving on. Omnipotence means power to do all or everything, and we are told in Scripture that with God all things are possible. It is common enough in argument with an unbeliever to be told that God, if he existed and were good, would do this or that, and then if we point out that the proposed action is impossible, to be met with the retort, but I thought God was supposed to be able to do anything. This raises the whole question of impossibility. In ordinary usage, the word impossible generally implies a suppressed clause beginning with the word unless. Thus, it is impossible for me to see the street from where I sit writing this at the moment. That is, it is impossible to see the street unless I go up to the top floor where I shall be high enough to overlook the intervening building. If I had broken my leg, I should say, but it is impossible for me to go up to the top floor. Meaning, however, that it is impossible unless some friends turn up who will carry me. Now let us advance to a different plane of impossibility by saying it is, at any rate, impossible to see the street so long as I remain where I am and the intervening building remains where it is. Someone might add, unless the nature of space or of vision were different from what it is. I do not know what the best philosophers and scientists would say to this, but I should have to reply, I don't know whether space and vision could possibly have been of such a nature as you suggest. Now it is clear that the words could possibly here refer to some absolute kind of possibility or impossibility, which is different from the relative possibilities and impossibilities we have been considering. I cannot say whether seeing round corners is, in this new sense, possible or not, because I do not know whether it is self-contradictory or not. But I know very well that if it is self-contradictory, it is absolutely impossible. The absolutely impossible may also be called the intrinsically impossible, because it carries its impossibility within itself, instead of borrowing it from other impossibilities, which in their turn depend upon others. It has no unless clause attached to it. It is impossible under all conditions and in all worlds and for all agents. Now that's a lot of chat, and you can boil that down to like a simpler turn of phrase. Again, I like C.S. Lewis, but I think he overstates the case, but I guess he kind of has to, because you will run into people who will say things like, if God is all-powerful, why doesn't he just do this or that, this thing or that thing that I kind of want him to do? And when we do say that can't be done, and people respond by saying, but if God is all-powerful, surely he can do it. And the answer is, well, no. God can't do things, like he can work miracles, where he can turn water into wine and heal the sick and raise the dead. Like all those things can happen. But I want you to picture Lazarus, for example, the tomb of Lazarus. And we would all agree and say people can't just get back up and walk out of the grave. And then we would say, unless God restores them to life. Fine, no problem there. But somebody then, if they were to say, but can God make Lazarus both dead and alive at the same time? Well, no, because the whole nature of being alive or being dead implies that you're not alive anymore. Like that's the category of being dead, is that you're not alive now. So certain things are inert and were never alive in the first place. So like this table, for example, is made up of metal and some sort of synthetic leather on the top of it. These things were never alive and therefore can't be called dead. But if you're wearing shoes that are made of actual leather, then if you were to have this logical conundrum that would say, can these shoes both be worn by me and still be part of a living, breathing cow at the same time? And the answer is no, they can't. Like, not because God can't do that, but because by definition these things are separate and apart from each other. They don't exist in the same logical world. So when people come up with what boils down to intrinsic impossibilities, things that can't be done by their nature, like by their logical nature, and say, but I thought God was all-powerful. The argument that keeps coming up is the one that says, can God make a rock so big he can't lift it? The answer is no, because by definition such a rock does not exist and cannot exist. And if somebody says, well, I thought he was all-powerful, I'm like, yeah, well, obviously, but if his omnipotence would be limited by a very large rock, then he can't make that rock now, can he? Because such a rock logically doesn't exist and can't. That shouldn't be that hot of a take, and it's very important to make that distinction, because unless you get this worked out as far as possibility goes, then nothing else makes sense, because everything else will boil down to somebody saying, but if God's all-powerful, surely he can, ba, 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 ba. And it's usually something like, if God is all-powerful, why doesn't he get rid of all the suffering in the world? If God's all-powerful, why doesn't he get rid of all the evil in the world? If God is all-powerful, why doesn't he just make everything good for everybody all the time, forever? And that's when we hit these logical impossibilities or these intrinsic impossibilities. So to continue on, All agents here includes God himself. His omnipotence means power to do all that is intrinsically possible, not to do the intrinsically impossible. You may attribute miracles to him, but not nonsense. This is no limit to his power. If you choose to say God can give a creature free will and at the same time withhold free will from it, you have not succeeded in saying anything about God. Meaningless combinations of words do not suddenly acquire meaning simply because we prefix to them the other two words God can. It remains true that all things are possible with God. The intrinsic impossibilities are not things but non-entities. It is no more possible for God than for the weakest of his creatures to carry out both of two mutually exclusive alternatives, not because his power meets an obstacle, but because nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk about God. It should, however, be remembered that human reasoners often make mistakes, either by arguing from false data or by inadvertence in the argument itself. We may thus come to think that things are possible which are really impossible, and vice versa. We ought, therefore, to use great caution in defining those intrinsic impossibilities which even omnipotence cannot perform. What follows is to be regarded less as an assertion of what they are than a sample of what they might be like. So again, it's a very simple point that has to be well defined before you can go any further with anything. If the problem of pain or evil or suffering is being raised within a theological window, you have to be able to define what God's limits are. Because if we're living in a free will universe, the free will universe carries with it certain intrinsic requirements of it. I'll explain it this way. Not like you need me to, but the people online might. You know how they are, right? So when you're watching a werewolf movie, for example, because we just had Halloween, right? You're watching a werewolf movie, and it's specifically set up, and you're allowing your brain to work within a framework. You're allowing your brain to work within a framework that says that there are werewolves while you watch this movie. There are werewolves. The werewolves turn into werewolves every full moon, every night of a full moon. They become horrible creatures, and they go out at night and kill people and devour sheep, and they ruin things. And these werewolves can only be killed with a silver bullet, right? You have all this worked out in your mind. It makes sense because you're watching the movie, and there you are. Now, we all know that those things on their surface are impossible, right? Like there aren't such things as werewolves. They don't exist. People don't turn into horrible wolf-like creatures on full moons, that kind of thing. We all get that. But if the end of that movie concludes with somebody just picking up a random shotgun and shooting that werewolf to death, like not with a silver bullet, but just with like an ordinary shotgun shell, you would be well within your rights to cry foul about that and say, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Now, if your friend that you're watching the movie with says to you, none of this makes any sense, it's got wolf people in it, and you say, I know it doesn't make any sense that it has wolf people that obviously don't exist, but it doesn't make any sense within its own rules. Like it clearly set up and defined rules, and then it chose to break them at the last second. If you had a universe in which there were like vampires, and it clearly defined that vampires could only be killed with a stake through the heart or whatever, and then somebody just chops his head off halfway through the movie and he dies, and you'd say, well, wait a minute, I thought this set up that you needed a stake through the heart, and people would say, well, why are you complaining? It's just a movie. And you'd say, yes, I know it's just a movie, but the movie has to exist within its own rules. Now, in a sense, we're not talking about fiction when we're talking about God, but we are working with something that has its own rules attached to it. God can perform miracles. He can work outside of the natural order of things to make things happen that cannot otherwise proceed. So he can turn water into wine, he can walk on water, he can heal the sick, he can raise the dead, that kind of thing. But he can't do the logically impossible because they are mutually exclusive things that just cannot exist together. God cannot, through sheer force of will and divine omnipotence, make the color green red, but also have it be green at the same time. Like, that doesn't work because those two things do not exist together logically, that kind of thing. And if people kick back at that and say, well, but I thought God could do anything, that's like saying, yeah, but in this movie, I thought the werewolf had to be killed with a silver bullet. It has to work within the rules as presented. You can't just do whatever you want within this framework. I hope that makes sense well enough, that the logical work that you have to do has to be laid down in order for the arguments to proceed. Now, this next little bit, now that we're done talking, if you guys read this in advance, and I hope you did, the end of that last paragraph and the beginning of the next paragraph seem like they're in different universes, and I don't know quite how we made that leap. When he says, what follows is to be regarded as less an assertion of what they are than a sample of what they might be like. And then, the inexorable laws of nature which operate in defiance of human suffering or desert, which are not turned aside by prayer, seem at first sight to furnish a strong argument against the goodness and power of God. It seems like there's a big leap there, but we're getting there, I promise. I'm going to submit that not even omnipotence could create a society of free souls without at the same time creating a relatively independent and inexorable nature. There is no reason to suppose that self-consciousness, the recognition of a creature by itself as a self, can exist except in contrast with an other, a something which is not the self. It is an environment against an environment, and preferably a social environment, an environment of other selves, that the awareness of myself stands out. This would raise a difficulty about the consciousness of God if we were mere theists. Being Christians, we learn from the doctrine of the Blessed Trinity that something analogous to society exists within the divine being from all eternity, that God is love, not merely in the sense of being the Platonic form of love, but because within him the concrete reciprocities of love exist before all worlds and are thence derived to the creatures. This whole bit here, I must confess, he kind of loses me on. And maybe he lost you, or maybe you can all tell me what's going on, because I can't tell you. As in, it doesn't seem like this whole little bit here is necessary to what's going on. I don't know why he has to argue for the importance of nature and society to exist. I suppose because the question will come up that if we were to be perfectly happy, we would have to be perfectly happy on our own without any effect on any other human being, I suppose. Because, all right, well, let's, did anybody stay up late last night watching any TV, or did you all go to bed sensibly? Because still nothing's decided. Yeah, it could be anything, right? Any random topic. Well, it could be that by now that the election has been decided for President Trump or for President Biden, and one of them will be the president-elect. Maybe they already are. I don't know. I haven't checked the news lately. Still no? It's going to be days yet. But here's the thing, is both of them want to be president. Only one can be. So now if you're existing in a universe where God wants everybody to be happy, and then God would, in theory, be mingling in the Electoral College to make one outcome happen, he can't make them both happy, right? He can't make them both president of the United States. It's a one-person office. So even if God wanted to interfere and stack the deck and make it so that one of those two guys were to be the president, he can't make them both president. That's not how that works. So if you are existing in nature, in the universe in which you have interactions with other human beings, then you are going to have outcomes that are going to be good for some and bad for another. Like, no matter what happens over the next weeks or whatever, as court cases go on and ballots get found and lost and found again over the next little while, no matter what happens, somebody, and probably a lot of somebodies, are going to get pretty upset. It's like when people sort of look to God for some sort of positive outcome for their sports team, and you'll say, well, all right, well, but you can't both win, can you? Like, the best you can hope for is that you tie, but you can't both win. Again, by definition, that's how that works. Any sort of game that you play where everybody wins is not a game at all, because there is really effectively no point in playing it, especially not by the rules. So, I mean, I guess he's going over this to try and let us know that the precondition for our existence as creatures that have free will requires that we live in contact with other people, and certainly with God himself, which must be the precondition for that, I suppose. But he's answering an argument that I've never heard before. Anytime somebody has come up to me and said, hey, why do bad things happen to good people? They've never said, hey, why do we have a society at all? Like, why is it not just me and God and that's it if he wants me to be happy? Like, nobody's ever made that argument. Maybe they could, but it's never come up with me, which is why I'm so confused as to why this is here. Maybe this was a big hot topic back in 1941 or whenever he wrote this. What's the copyright date on this bad boy? 1940, close enough, ballpark right. Okay, again, I'm not sure. Like, I really don't know whether it's because we're a society and God's not, but he's saying here, starting the next paragraph here,
he does say you learn something yourself from the community that something analogous to society exists within the divine.
Yeah, indeed, but why that's necessary for this conversation, that's what eludes me. Again, the freedom of a creature must mean freedom to choose, and choice implies the existence of things to choose between. A creature with no environment would have no choices to make, so that freedom, like self-consciousness, if they are not indeed the same thing, again demands the presence to the self of something other than the self. The minimum condition of self-consciousness and freedom, then, would be that the creature should apprehend God and therefore itself as distinct from God. It is possible that such creatures exist, aware of God in themselves, but of no fellow creatures. If so, their freedom is simply of making a single naked choice, of loving God more than the self, or the self more than God. But a life so reduced to essentials is not imaginable to us. As soon as we attempt to introduce the mutual knowledge of fellow creatures, we run up against the necessity of nature. People often talk as if nothing were easier than for two naked minds to meet or to become aware of each other. But I see no possibility of their doing so except in a common medium which forms their external world or environment. Even our vague attempt to imagine such a meeting between disembodied spirits usually slips in surreptitiously the idea at least of a common space and common time to give the in coexistence a meaning. And space and time are already an environment. But more than this is required. If your thoughts and passions were directly present to me, like my own, without any mark of externality or otherness, how should I distinguish them from mine? And what thoughts or passions could we begin to have without objects to think and feel about? Nay, could I even begin to have the conception of the external and other unless I had an experience of an external world? Again, it goes on from here for a little bit. And I'm not sure, maybe you find it to be useful, in which case I'll continue, but I don't find it to be that useful. And again, I like C.S. Lewis a lot, so C.S. Lewis, if you're listening, if you're watching this on Facebook Live, from beyond the grave, if you are tuning in, I apologize, but you've lost me here. Which is too bad because, I mean, I guess, and frequently when I'm cornered at parties and people start asking me about the problem of death and the hellfire and whatnot, they typically don't want you to go into as much detail as you do. When they'll say, if God's so great, how come my dog died? And then you'll get into like the real depths of sin and pain and causality and all that kind of stuff, and they'll say, well, I just wanted a simple answer, and you'll say, well, there isn't a simple answer, not really. But sure enough here, he's going deeper than I want him to, because I don't think we need to get into if God's so good, how come there is matter and space? I sort of just assume that there is. I'm not sure if we need to delve too deeply into it. Garth, how are you on that? Do we need to get too deep into it?
People definitely wonder, why is there something as opposed to nothing?
Right. But he's not answering that question in terms of the creation framework, but more in terms of the existence of people framework, I suppose. That if you are going to have human beings having free will, it requires a place to have free will in, which makes sense, I suppose. Like, you have to have some knowledge of something other than yourself, which is fine. I'm going to skip ahead a bit. Please don't mind me that I do. If chat's going to complain about that, Chris, let me know. If somebody in chat's going to say, well, hold on, you. Can we skip ahead to the paragraph that begins with society then implies a common field? Yeah, Chris found it. Good. Society then implies a common field or a world in which its members meet. If there is an angelic society, as Christians have usually believed, then the angels also must have such a world or field, something which is to them as matter in the modern, not the scholastic sense, is to us. But if matter is to serve as a neutral field, it must have a fixed nature of its own. If a world or material system had only a single inhabitant, it might conform at every moment to his wishes. Trees, for his sake, would crowd into a shade. But if you were introduced into a world in which thus varied at my every whim, you would be quite unable to act in it, and would thus lose the exercise of your free will. Nor is it clear that you can make your presence known to me, all the matter by which you attempted to make signs to me already being in my control, and therefore not capable of being manipulated by you. So I guess that's the point of what he's saying, which is that if there are multiple people, multiple beings in the world, and matter exists externally to all of them, you can't make something that is universally good for everybody at the same time. Trump and Biden can't both be president at the same time. If I eat a quarter pounder with cheese, Ray can't also eat that same burger, right? Like, that's how that works. Once it's eaten, it's gone, and can go no further. That's a sort of a necessary precondition of things. And if I were to manipulate all matter around myself so to fit me, then it would be bad for other people, again, by definition, because it would suit only myself. And if matter and creation and society are vital preconditions of things, then you're stuck with the idea that people, and again, this is where we get into the logical existence of things. So if there is matter and matter cannot be good for everybody at the same time based on their different needs, then you can't have a God who can make things good for everybody all the time if the matter and space that we're in is a vital precondition of our existence. Because it obviously is, because here we are, right? And he goes into all that, and we don't need to. There we go. Ha ha ha. Again, if matter has a fixed nature and obeys constant laws, not all states of matter will be equally agreeable to the wishes of a given soul, nor all equally beneficial for that particular aggregate of matter which he calls his body. If fire comforts that body at a certain distance, it will destroy it when the distance is reduced. Hence, even in a perfect world, the necessity for those danger signals which the pain fibers in our nerves are apparently designed to transmit. Does this mean an inevitable element of evil in the form of pain in any possible world? I think not, for while it may be true that the least sin is an incalculable evil, the evil of pain depends on degree, and pains below a certain intensity are not feared or resented at all. No one minds the process, warm, beautifully hot, too hot, it stings, which warns him to withdraw his hand from exposure to the fire. And if I may trust my own feeling, a slight aching in the legs as we climb into bed after a good day's walking is in fact pleasurable. Yet again, if the fixed nature of matter prevents it from being always and in all its dispositions equally agreeable even to a single soul, much less it is possible for the matter of the universe at any moment to be distributed so it is equally convenient and pleasurable to each member of a society. If a man traveling in one direction is having a journey downhill, a man going in the opposite direction must be going uphill. If even a pebble lies where I want it to lie, it cannot, except by a coincidence, be where you want it to lie. And this is very far from being an evil. On the contrary, it furnishes occasion for all those acts of courtesy, respect, and unselfishness by which love and good humor and modesty express themselves. But it certainly leaves the way open to a great evil, that of competition and hostility. And if souls are free, they cannot be prevented from dealing with the problem by competition instead of courtesy. And once they have advanced to actual hostility, they can then exploit the fixed nature of matter to hurt one another. The permanent nature of wood, which enables us to use it as a beam, also enables us to use it for hitting our neighbor on the head. The permanent nature of matter in general means that when human beings fight, the victory ordinarily goes to those who have superior weapons, skill, and number, even if their cause is unjust. I mean, I hope that makes sense well enough that, and I guess that's why he goes into the entire precondition for matter and space and time to exist as it is, which is to say that if we are in a material world, which we are, there will be, because we're living in a material world and we're material girls, right? There you go. But if that's the case, then you can't have matter matter or even outcomes that are good for everybody at all times in all places. It doesn't work that way. You will have a natural consequence of an outcome being good for somebody, which is by definition less good for somebody else. If certain resources are used by one person for warmth or for locomotion or that kind of thing, they can't also be used for by somebody else. It doesn't work that way. If Donald Trump gets a vote, that vote can't also go to Joe Biden, that kind of thing. By definition, these things don't work and can't work. His usage of saying, if you can turn wood into a beam, you can also hit somebody on the head with it, which is true. If you can use a baseball bat for hitting a baseball, you can also use it for hitting somebody else. That's how that works. And to say that if God was good, he wouldn't let you hit somebody else with that baseball bat, well, I suppose not. But that would carry with it an essential violation of the freedom of will that we have. In other words, if you have free will, your free will has consequences attached to it. It doesn't count as free will if no matter when you deviate, there are no consequences to it. Picture it like this. I went to Disneyland back when you could travel to the States. Remember those crazy days? Wow, wild. And Bruce and Luke insisted that we go to Autopia. Have you ridden Autopia? Chris, you have? Yeah, all right. Autopia is a fun little thing to do because it's like a driving course where they have these little like gas-powered cars that you can drive around this course. But of course, it's not safe to let somebody Bruce's age drive a car. So the way they have it worked out is your car in Autopia, A, doesn't go very fast, and B, runs on a track. So even though you can steer it in theory, the track that you're on stops you from going too far. If you steer like way off to the left, like you'll turn the wheels, but the track that you're on won't let you go. Like it will curb you by nature. So you can't, like Bruce can't get all the way through that course and then get out at the end and say, now I know how to drive. Like, no, you don't. You were like, you thought you had free will, but your free will was curbed. Or if you're bowling, let's say, and they have those bumpers up on either side of the lane, you can't like claim that you got a great score because you like literally could not get a gutter ball. Like any score of 0 was prevented effectively because you were stopped from hitting the gutter ball at any time by the purpose of those barriers existing. That's how that works. So if your free will doesn't carry with it actual consequences, then you didn't have a free will at all. You had the illusion of choice, but no choices you could actually make. If you're reading a novel and you start on page 1 and you read right the way through to the end, and the characters in the novel make choices, they don't actually have free will, even though you are going with them like in real time throughout what's going on in the novel, step by step, piece by piece. At any moment, you could skip right the way to the end of the book, and the outcome will be the same, and all their choices would be taken out of it because their choices as the people in the novel are by definition set, even though in their own universe they had free will. But they really didn't because they had no choices to make because there were no consequences. Everything was set for them like that. So if we are creatures who have free will, but God removes any kind of choice or consequence of our choices, then we don't actually have free will. Then we just have the illusion of free will, but no actual options. We can perhaps conceive of a world in which God corrected the results of this abuse of free will by his creatures at every moment, so that a wooden beam became soft as grass when it was used as a weapon, and the air refused to obey me if I attempted to set it up in the sound waves that carry lies or insults. But such a world would be one in which wrong actions were impossible, and which therefore freedom of the will would be void. Nay, if the principle were carried out to its logical conclusion, evil thoughts would be impossible, for the cerebral matter which we use in thinking would refuse its task when we attempted to frame them. All matter in the neighborhood of a wicked man would be liable to undergo unpredictable alterations. That God can and does, on occasions, modify the behavior of matter and produce what we call miracles is part of Christian faith, but the very conception of a common and therefore stable world demands that these occasions should be extremely rare. In a game of chess, you can make certain arbitrary concessions to your opponent, which stand to the ordinary rule of the games as miracles stand to the laws of nature. You can deprive yourself of a castle, or allow the other man sometimes to take back a move made inadvertently. But if you conceded everything that at any moment happened to suit him, if all his moves were revocable and all your pieces disappeared whenever their position on the board was not to his liking, then you could not have a game at all. So it is with the life of souls in a world. Fixed laws, consequences unfolding by causal necessity, the whole natural order are at once limits within which their common life is confined, and also the sole condition under which any such life is possible. Try to exclude the possibility of suffering which the order of nature and the existence of free wills involve, and you find that you have excluded life itself. More often than not, and this is a very glib way of looking at it, but it's the argument that I usually make with people, where they say something along the lines of, if God is so good, why doesn't he get rid of all the evil in the world? And my response in a very glib fashion is to say to people, great, do you want him to start with you? Because you do things that you shouldn't. Should he by nature wipe you out of existence? Because you obviously do things that God and your fellow human beings don't want you to do. Would you be willing for him to start with you? And if not, if you're saying, well, no, but why doesn't God get rid of the actual evil in the world? Why should he not start with you? Why should he not make your hand fall off when you're about to write something slanderous on social media? Why should he not cause your tongue to drop out when you are about to slander your friends and neighbors in person? Why should he not make your legs fall off before you can get in the car and drive somewhere you shouldn't to see people you shouldn't? Why doesn't he do all that? Is it because those are not big things? How badly does this problem scale? Does it go down to the individual and to his thoughts and words and deeds, or does it not? More often than not, what people think to themselves is to say, well, if God's so good, why didn't he make Hitler just die when he was a baby? Well, I mean, I guess, maybe he could have, I suppose. But you've got to understand that if God doesn't smite all the evil in the world, then you don't really have much ground to complain. And especially when people will doubly complain, well, they'll say, well, you know that part in the Bible where God makes that flood happen and kills everybody? That wasn't very nice of him. You'll say, well, what do you want? Do you want God to wipe out all the evil in the world or not? If you do, you have to understand that the flood, where he wipes out all the people who had done bad things, which is, everybody, is where that argument goes to. But again, frequently people don't want to talk about it as like a logical issue. They want to just say, why doesn't God stop things that are bad happening to me? But he shouldn't stop me doing bad things to other people. Well, bravo, but that's not really a problem of why is there suffering in the world. That's a problem of why doesn't God just do what I want? And that's a different problem altogether. We can talk about that problem separately. But if you're talking about saying, why doesn't God get rid of all the evil in the world, you have to understand that he should start with you. You don't want him to. That applies to everybody else as well. Now what? And as I say, it's a different question altogether. As I said before, this account of the intrinsic necessities of a world is meant merely as a specimen of what they might be. What they really are, only omniscience has the data and the wisdom to see, but they are not likely to be less complicated than I have suggested. Needless to say, complicated here refers solely to the human understanding of them. We are not to think of God arguing, as we do, from an end, coexistence of free spirits, to the conditions involved in it, but rather of a single, utterly self-consistent act of creation, which to us appears at first sight as the creation of many independent things, and then as the creation of things mutually necessary. Even we can rise a little beyond the conception of mutual necessities as I have outlined it, can reduce matter as that which separates souls and matter as that which brings them together under the single concept of plurality, whereof separation and togetherness are only two aspects. With every advance in our thought, the unity of the creative act and the impossibility of tinkering with the creation as though this or that element of it could have been removed will become more apparent. Perhaps this is not the best of all possible universes, but the only possible one. Possible worlds can mean only worlds that God could have made but didn't. The idea of that which God could have done involves a too anthropomorphic conception of God's freedom. Whatever human freedom means, divine freedom cannot mean indeterminacy between alternatives and choice of one of them. Perfect goodness can never debate about the end to be attained, and perfect wisdom cannot debate about the means most suited to achieve it. The freedom of God consists in the fact that no cause other than himself produces his acts, and no external obstacle impedes them, that his own goodness is the root from which they all grow, and his own omnipotence is the air in which they all flower. I'll just finish it up then, and we'll wrap up. And that brings us to our next subject, the divine goodness. Nothing so far has been said of this, and no answer attempted to the objection that if the universe must from the outset admit the possibility of suffering, then absolute goodness would have left the universe uncreated. And I must warn the reader that I shall not attempt to prove that to create was better than to not create. I am aware of no human scales in which such a portentous question can be weighed. Some comparison between one state of being and another can be made, but the attempt to compare being and not being exists in mere words. It would be better for me not to exist. In what sense? For me. How should I, if I did not exist, profit by not existing? Our design is a less formidable one. It is only to discover how, perceiving a suffering world and being assured on quite different grounds that God is good, we are to conceive that goodness and suffering without contradiction. And it thus ends the chapter. So, I guess it does come down to, in a roundabout sense, the complication of the existence of everything, the existence of the universe that we're in right now, and how people would want to find a world without suffering within the current limitations that we've got. If we have the universe that we have, how can God, within this universe, make it good and right and perfect, even though it has these necessary limitations attached to it? If matter is limited and finite, if people occupy space and time, if they have internal organs and they breathe and blink and stuff like that, how can you arrive at a space in which there is no suffering for any of them? And the answer is you can't, because by making things better for some, you make them worse for others. That's how that works. There isn't enough of everything to go around all the time, and even if there were, the act of doing things that you want probably means somebody else doesn't want them done that way. It's very simple stuff like that. And when people say things like, well, okay, but why can't God make a universe in which all these things could be satisfied? I've often wondered, when you're reading the ingredient list on, cereal, and you're going down the list of cereal, and it makes, the first half makes sense, because it says, ingredients, corn, oats, flax, and you're like, this all makes sense so far. And then all of a sudden the wheels fall off and it goes like maltodextrin, sodium carbonate, BHT added to preserve freshness, and blah, 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 blah. And you go through all this and you say, hey, why don't we make this cereal without that stuff? Why don't we just make it full of corn and oats and flax, and then we can just eat that, right? Well, you could, but it wouldn't still be the same cereal at the end of it. You would not still have oat squares if they took out the monosodium glutamate or whatever it is. They don't just add that stuff for fun. It's a necessary precondition of the recipe as it exists. If you remove part of it, you won't still have the same product left at the end of it. You will have something different. It will likely be less to your liking because it'll be missing essential components. Now, there are some swaps you can make, that kind of thing. But once you hit a certain, a base level where nothing further can be changed, it's a lot like saying, boy, I hate the taste of Diet Coke. I love the taste of Coke. Why don't they just make Diet Coke taste like Coke? You think they didn't think of that? You think that wasn't the forefront of their thoughts the whole time, to say, to try and make it taste as much like Coke as they could within the limitations? They've obviously done the best they can on that, and it's still not great. It is not close enough that you can't tell the difference. Boy, you can tell the difference, let me tell you. So if that's the case, knowing that there are limitations of space and time and matter, that these things exist and exist by definition, that to say, why doesn't God, if he's all-powerful, make all the suffering go away? He can't do that within the limitations that we currently have. If we are living in the universe that we're living in, and as I said, I eat a sandwich, Ray can't also eat that sandwich. It's impossible at that point. And it doesn't stop being nonsense when we talk about God. If my happiness requires certain things, and then therefore, well, let's make it much simpler, shall we? Let's say I'm going to date myself real hard here. let's say my happiness depends on marrying Cindy Crawford, let's say, and boy, I'm dating myself there. Remember her? Yikes. But if my happiness depends on marrying Cindy Crawford, I don't think her happiness depends on marrying me, right? And should she have some say in this? But her say on her happiness would likely invalidate my say on my happiness. Now, I may say, don't I have a right to be happy? And we would say, yes, but not the right to be happy at her expense. That is, one of you is going to be unhappy about this. Somebody's got to be disappointed at this. And that's not even a case of there being limited resources, right? Like, we're not talking about a burger or a sandwich. We're talking about human beings. But of course, desires aren't always going to line up. Now, fortunately in my life, I happen to want to marry the person who also wanted to marry me, so gangbusters. But you can't claim I have the right to be happy, therefore other people should be miserable to make my happiness exist. That's where the problem of pain really hits the road, because of course we can say, if God was all powerful, why wouldn't he make Cindy Crawford fall in love with me? Oh, whoa, that's not how that works. That's not how that works at all, because that would be God being incredibly cruel to her to be kind to me, and we would then say that that's not God alleviating my suffering, that's him causing suffering for somebody else. And in that case, a supermodel from the 1980s. All right, any further questions from the people that are here in person, or from the people that are on chat? All right, outstanding, good. Then I'll wrap up with a word of prayer, and then we can move on to chapter the 3rd next time of Divine Goodness, which is another chapter. Gracious Lord, we thank you for making us, which seems like an obvious thing to say. Obviously, we're here so we can thank you. But of all the universes that it could have existed, we're happy that it's this one, and for all the people who could have existed, we're grateful that we're here. That we are here to observe your goodness, to observe the creation that you've made, and to take part in the work that you would have us do. Instead of seeing things as barriers to our happiness, let us see them as opportunities for service. That there are limited things around, and you have equipped us to share them, to redistribute them, to give them to people who need them, and to make peace in the world, even though it is a limited one. We thank you for that opportunity. We ask for your strength in carrying it out. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, thanks everybody. We shall catch you all with masks on next time.